One thing that you don't hear so much about in Western media is any analysis of what militant groups like Hamas are thinking strategically. And there's a reason for this. It comes from the war on terror. Rather than thinking about designated terrorist groups as being political and military organizations which have strategic objectives and an internal logic for their actions, we're encouraged to think of them as being irrationally evil, animalistic, and barbarous. And the problem with that is that you don't end up with much of an idea of what's going on or what's going to happen next. So, what does Hamas have to say about their own military and political aims? Al Jazeera reported these quotes of Khalil al-Yahya, the deputy chief of Hamas political bureau, from an interview conducted by Press TV. "We've revealed to the whole world the true face of the Israeli occupation," the Hamas official said. "While the Palestinian cause is the cause of all Muslims, the amount of support shown by other Arab countries has not been sufficient," he added. Yet, he hoped that the sum of this support will lead to victory. Al-Yahya also told Press TV that America will pay a dear price in terms of its interests around the world for its support to Israel. What this means is that Hamas doesn't see the huge loss of life in Gaza since October 7th or the destruction of its governmental infrastructure as a blow to its objectives. Instead, their goal is to delegitimize Israel's international standing by provoking them into an enormous, bloody, and genocidal act of retribution. What's more, Israel's actions in Gaza have threatened the normalization process with other Arab states like Saudi Arabia. And as American military targets have come under attack by Iranian-backed militias in Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, it's clear that events since October the 7th have kept the US entangled in the Middle East exactly at the time they'd rather be focusing on Russia and Eastern Europe. So, by these narrow metrics at least, Hamas have succeeded in achieving some of its strategic objectives. Back in November, Khalil al-Yahya told the New York Times this: "We succeeded in putting the Palestinian issue back on the table, and now no one in the region is experiencing calm." Now, there are good reasons to be skeptical of this. Obviously, it's in Hamas's interests to claim that everything is going according to plan, even if the losses incurred in Gaza are much higher than their leadership may have anticipated back in October. Israel has the military advantages of equipment, technology, money, and mobilization in Gaza. But fierce battles around the site of Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City indicate that Hamas fighters have the ability to capitalize on the constraints that urban warfare has on conventional armies. I want to show you a heat map from the Critical Threats Project and the Institute for the Study of War. It shows attacks by Palestinian militants on Israeli forces in northern Gaza since mid-February of this year. You can see there are high concentrations of attacks in and around Gaza City, particularly in and around Al-Shifa Hospital. Now, all of this is taking place in territory that's coloured blue on the map, indicating areas where Israeli clearing operations had already taken place. The purple striped areas show, quote, areas reportedly infiltrated by Palestinian militias. The human cost of Israeli operations in North Gaza have been nothing short of devastating. According to a UN report, 70% of the population are already suffering with catastrophic levels of hunger. And reports have emerged from Al-Shifa Hospital alleging execution-style killings and other abuses by Israeli forces. But what the Critical Threats Project are implying is that the civilian suffering in northern Gaza hasn't deterred militant activity. They write this: "Most of the Palestinian militia attacks on March 27th targeted Israeli forces in and around Al-Shifa Hospital. Palestinian militias have conducted nearly 70 attacks targeting Israeli forces in and around the hospital since Israeli forces returned to the area on March 18th. This high rate of attack indicates that Palestinian militias retain a significant degree of combat effectiveness in the area, despite continued Israeli clearing efforts around Gaza City." The report continues: A Palestinian journalist reported on March 27th that Israeli forces advanced into parts of Zaytun neighborhood in southwestern Gaza City. The IDF concluded a 2-week-long re-clearing of Zaytun on March the 3rd. The return of Israeli forces to the neighborhood suggests that Palestinian militias continue to operate there, similar to how these militias still have a presence in other portions of the northern Gaza Strip. To put it bluntly, Hamas and other militant groups are popping up in areas which the IDF had supposedly established control over. After claiming to have destroyed Hamas infrastructure and established its presence in Gaza City, the IDF keep finding themselves pulled back into firefights. Despite having lobbied hard for a ground invasion and demanded the wholesale destruction of Hamas as a military objective, it looks like the Israeli army have been caught short in their planning. This is from an FT report about the battle for Al-Shifa Hospital. The fact that Israel had to go back to this place is a reflection of the fact that we have no strategy. That's from Michael Milstein, former Israeli intelligence officer. What I'd add is that what we're seeing in northern Gaza isn't just an indictment of Israel's post-war planning. It's indicative of some of the disadvantages of being a technologically superior, conventional army. Israeli forces have been leading with heavy aerial bombardment before sending ground troops into urban areas. Their rationale is that this is safer for their troops, even if it means killing thousands of Palestinian civilians in the process. But as anyone who's watched the Battle of Stalingrad could tell you, there are downsides to fighting in rubble. It's a lot harder for ground troops to navigate bombed out streets and buildings. Part of the reason is likely to be that Israel's army is made up of reservists and conscripts as well as regular troops, meaning they're not sending in an elite team of special forces. These are guys who aren't all well trained or super experienced. But if you're fighting a guerrilla war like Hamas and the PIJ are, there are advantages to fighting an enemy that's bogged down by destroyed roads and debris. And Hamas fighters are highly trained, they're disciplined, and a lot of them are quite experienced. They might not have the advantages of high-tech weaponry and surveillance, but unlike the IDF, they're fighting on home turf. Joris, Netanyahu has vowed to keep fighting in Gaza until Hamas is destroyed. Does the fact that they keep on popping up in areas supposedly cleared by the IDF mean that, ironically, his political survival is connected to their military survival?
Is it even this ironic? I mean, this wouldn't be the first time that Netanyahu's interest and Hamas's interest align, or Liquid's interest and Hamas's interest align. Netanyahu knows that the day the war ends is also the day his whole career ends, with all of the trouble that he already had before, and plus this situation, the war. The fact that it's still going now is already a failure from Netanyahu's perspective. So in this instance, it's in his interest to make it last as long as possible. But from a military perspective, the IDF's interests are the opposite. Because here, Hamas's goal initially was to provoke and shock Israel, which they did on the 7th of October. But after that, no one, including Hamas, doubted that the IDF would have military superiority. So their strategy became surviving until the end of the war. They win by not losing. From Hamas's perspective, they win by not losing. Whereas for the IDF loses by not winning. And on the other hand, the Israeli leadership sort of backed themselves into a corner. Netanyahu backed himself into a corner by amplifying the message that Hamas is an existential threat to Israel, because it leaves them no acceptable outcome than total annihilation, which is pretty much impossible. How would you even prove that? How would you determine whether Hamas is destroyed or not? And this is something that I keep repeating. They want total destruction of Hamas, but do we even know what that would look like? How would we know that Hamas has been destroyed? And how do you destroy a group of people, especially when they are among civilians as well? So here, the goals of the IDF and the goals of Hamas are completely asymmetric. Not losing on war is, for Hamas, is much more attainable as a strategic goal than outright winning it, which was or would have been the IDF's goal, and which they didn't achieve or they haven't achieved yet. So some military analysts claim that Israel has already lost the war simply by not outright winning it, and regardless of the outcome of the conflict.
I mean, one of the things that struck me as I was researching this story and writing it up is that a very simple question doesn't get asked in mainstream media, which is, from Hamas's perspective, is this war going well or going badly? And for me, that just seems like such an obvious question to ask. Why is it that we don't see it posed in English-speaking media?
Because that would entail thinking about what Hamas might be thinking. So that's humanizing them already. And that's something that we have been conditioned to not do, to not consider them as human. As you said, they are being demonized. They are described as animals without any rational thoughts. And that's orchestrated by Israel to present the enemy as non-human, as a monster, as a scary, dangerous monster. So we are being conditioned to not consider that, whether we agree with them or not, and obviously we don't agree with them, but to not consider them as rational thinking. So that's the reason why we never really ask that question, because just the mere exercise of thinking, how is it going for them, that forces you to walk in their shoes, which is something that we're not ready to, or at least the West as a society is not ready to allow us to do.
I mean, Sun Tzu famously said, know yourself and know your enemy, and you need not fear the result of 1,000 battles. And it seems to me that media and politics are united in a message that the enemy is stupid, even when they're not, which can only be bad news. Let's move on a little bit. We've talked about what the Battle of Al-Shifa can tell us about Hamas's military strategy. But one incident that occurred at the hospital also tells us something about how the group wants and needs to be seen on the world stage. In other words, it gives us an insight into their political strategy. In reporting on the war, Israel is generally seen as a credible source by Western media, though that reputation has certainly been dented over the last 6 months. We've seen falsehoods picked up involving burned and beheaded babies, atrocities denied by Israel only to be quietly confirmed later, and the government's continued insistence that aid is getting into Gaza, despite the denial of that claim by every major humanitarian agency in the world. Hamas, however, is never seen as credible. For example, the death and injury figures of the Hamas-run Gazan Health Ministry were disparaged by both Israel and the President of the United States, only to later be accepted by all parties as reasonably accurate. So, why is it so important to Hamas to put out accurate casualty figures? Well, the simple answer is that it helps them delegitimize Israel in the eyes of the international community. What they want is for the testimony coming out of Gaza to be believed by the wider world. Which is why something fairly unusual occurred at Al-Shifa earlier this week. During the IDF's assault on the medical complex, one Palestinian woman made these claims about the Israeli soldiers. They raped women, kidnapped women, executed women, and pulled dead bodies from under the rubble to unleash their dogs on them. Is there anything more horrifying than hearing women call for help? Al Jazeera published a video of that woman's testimony. But it quickly prompted a Hamas investigation, with Al Jazeera's former managing director Abu Hilale saying this shortly afterwards. It was revealed through Hamas investigations that the story of the rape of the woman in Shifa Hospital was fabricated. Of course, the enemy did not hesitate to commit the crime of genocide. The woman who spoke about rape justified her exaggeration and incorrect talk by saying that the goal was to arouse the nation's fervour and brotherhood. as if more than 30,000 martyrs, 90,000 wounded, about 1 million displaced people, and comprehensive destruction were not enough. Al Jazeera immediately removed their video. But what that speedy investigation shows is how seriously Hamas takes preserving the credibility of Palestinians' testimony as a key plank in their overall strategy. I do have a favour to ask. If you want to help us out with the algorithm, follow Novara Live on Spotify. It really does help new people find us, and whenever we're above the rest is politics in the charts, Alistair Campbell gets upset. So please follow us on Spotify and leave us a review. I think you can find the link in the description. Fox is giving me a thumbs up. I must be correct.